In 1969, having mopped up the students, Mao held a Congress of Victors, a party congress, at which his chosen heir apparent, Defense Minister Lin Biao, one of his longtime favorites, one of the great generals of the Civil War and the Anti-Japanese War, was named heir apparent. Lin Biao had been almost an absent figure during the early years of the People's Republic. He had pleaded illness, and it was only when the Cultural Revolution started that he was forced to come into the open and to make speeches in a rather stumbling manner, it must be said. And I suspect that Lin Biao really didn't want to be heir apparent, but if Mao said he was going to be heir apparent, he had no way of refusing. Now the problem for Mao was, however, when he had time to think about it, that what had happened as a result of his destruction of the party machine and the state machine during the early years of the Cultural Revolution, what had happened was that the military had taken over control of the country. That throughout the provinces of China, in almost every case, the leadership was made by generals and colonels. And so what you had was exact opposite of what Chairman Mao had always said as he was rising to power within the communist movement. And that is that the party must command the gun, not the gun the party. And he must have begun to think that this was very worrying, that the gun was now beginning to control the country. But he probably hoped in the first instance that as the party was reconstructed after the Congress in 1969, that the party would reassert itself and civilian control would be restored, even if under Lin Biao. The problem was, of course, that Lin Biao had no political constituency in the party or in the state machine. His basic constituency was military, and that must also have weighed a little with Mao. But what really triggered Mao was something quite different. There were clashes on the border at the time of the 1969 Party Congress, in which, after a preemptive attack by the Chinese, the Russians, Soviets, counterattacked and gave the Chinese a bloody nose. And it began to be clear to Mao that China could be attacked by the Soviet Union with impunity, and that the Chinese did not have sufficient weaponry, the right kind of weaponry, in order to defend itself. The People's Liberation Army was numerous but badly equipped. And he began to worry also about a surprise attack. The words Pearl Harbor were used. A surprise attack upon the Chinese capital, in which the Russians, the Soviets, would wipe out the Chinese Communist Party leadership, with whom they had tremendous differences of opinion as a result of Mao's attacks on them for revisionism. So Mao worried about this possibility of a surprise attack, and he had justification for this, because the previous year the Soviet Union had led troops of the satellite nations of Eastern Europe into Czechoslovakia to overthrow the Czech government, which was trying to have a more kinder, gentler communism, the Velvet Revolution. And at the time, the Soviets announced a new doctrine, that if a communist government, a communist party, was doing things which were not acceptable to the rest of the communist world, which is to say acceptable in Moscow, then they could be overthrown. And of course, the Chinese government, Chinese party, was certainly doing things which the Russians didn't like, and so it was an implicit threat against China. So Mao Zedong worried about a possible attack, and he issued an order that all the leaders of China should be scattered throughout the country in safety, so that if the capital were the victim of a surprise attack, they would not be killed. Except for one person, of course. Premier Zhou Enlai was left behind in Beijing as the person to keep the system running. Now, in this eventuality, where Mao kept on talking about the possibility of surprise attack, Defense Minister Lin Biao, now heir apparent, suddenly decided that he had to take an initiative. Hitherto, he'd always been very careful. He'd seen what had happened to Liu Shaoqi and other leaders, and he'd been very careful always to wait to see what Mao wanted and then to sign under him. But this time he felt, I'm the defense minister, I'm a military strategist of some success. I must do something to protect not merely the leaders, but the military from a surprise attack. And he went out, made some inspections, and issued a series of orders. And the result was that millions of troops, ships, aircraft across China were moved into positions of safety, greater safety in the case of a Soviet surprise attack. This was such a great movement that the Russians detected it, the Americans detected it, and both of them wondered what was happening in China. Mao was furious. Why was he furious? Lin Biao was only doing what Mao's warnings would suggest was necessary, protecting the military from a surprise attack. He was furious because for the first time in his lifetime as leader, someone else had demonstrated the ability to issue an order to the military, not countersigned by Mao himself, and the military would obey him. And suddenly Mao began to feel, Lin Biao can control the military, not just me, but he can control it too. And if you're in a position of dictatorial power, we've seen this in many, many situations across the globe, paranoia goes with the job. And Mao began to think that Lin Biao, despite the fact he was heir apparent, much younger than Mao, and would inherit in due course, that Lin Biao was out to take over before Mao died. And he began another guerrilla campaign against Lin Biao and his followers. And the result was that in the summer of 1971, according to the official accounts issued by Mao and his colleagues, Lin Biao ordered his son, who was an Air Force officer, to assassinate Chairman Mao. Whether he did or not is unclear. Maybe the son decided to do it by himself, we don't know. The evidence is very scatty. And so the attempt was made, apparently, to assassinate Mao. Totally ham-fisted attempt, because it nowhere got anywhere near actually doing it. And the chairman came back from the south, where he was ensuring that the military supported him and not Lin Biao, to the capital, and the Lin Biao family decided to flee, apparently. They got into a plane on the east coast with the holiday resort where they were, and urgently took off in the direction of the Soviet Union. Apparently, they had not had the time to refuel the plane, and the plane crashed in Mongolia. The good news about Lin Biao's flight to the Soviet Union was that Mao could point to him as a traitor. There was no need to justify anything about the persecution of Lin Biao because he was clearly a traitor. The bad news for Mao was that people in China couldn't understand how the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-wise chairman could possibly have had by his side all those years, all those decades, a man who was going to be a traitor, and how the chairman could have made him his heir apparent. How could he be so blind? And the result of this was that many Chinese, politically sophisticated Chinese, inside and outside the party, began to feel that the Cultural Revolution, whatever it was dreamt up as, an attempt to change the minds and hearts and souls of the Chinese people, was actually just a power struggle. And then Mao took a step which, in fact, negated the whole Cultural Revolution. Remember that he had said that the Soviets were appeasing the United States, and that was the wrong policy. But when the Russians and the Chinese clashed on the border, Mao began to realize that the People's Liberation Army was not going to be strong enough to defend China against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's weapons were far too powerful. And he needed some kind of bulwark to warn the Soviets off. And that's when he and President Nixon of the United States began tentative moves towards each other. And when President Nixon came to China in February '72, Chairman Mao suggested to him that the reason why Lin Biao had fled, the reason why he was a traitor, was because he had opposed the opening to the United States. Now, we have no way of knowing whether he did that or not, and there's no indication that he did it in any public or party forum. He may have opposed it. He may have said, why not try to make friends with the Soviets, who at least claimed to be communists, rather than with the imperialists. Because what the opening to America did was to undermine the whole basis of the Cultural Revolution. If the Cultural Revolution was designed to raise a new revolutionary generation who would not be appeasers of imperialism like the Soviets, then why was the leader of the imperialist camp, President Nixon, being invited to China? It was a puzzle. But more on President Nixon and his visit next time.